Welcome to the February EPERN seminar. Today we will hear a presentation by Erwin Dekker. Erwin is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center. He's an author of numerous journal articles. He's an expert in the intellectual history of the Austrian School of Economics. More recently, he wrote a book on Jan Tinbergen and the rise of economic expertise. He also has an edited volume with Pavel Kuhar under his belt. So those are some great contributions that I highly recommend you all check out. But today he will present a paper or a research project with Blaz Remic on sort of the different understandings of individualism, right, or within the Austrian tradition, right? Okay, so yes, welcome to EPERN, Erwin. Great to have you here again, and the screen is yours.
Thank you so much. Is this?
Yeah.
This is not going well.
No, we
Sorry
have a dark screen.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Some stuff also froze on my end, so.
Take your time. We have time. We have an hour and 20 minutes. We'll figure it out, right? Oh, there you go. All done. Yeah.
This is better, right?
Yeah. Right. We see your slides. Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. So let me jump straight in. Perhaps to say something, I regard this as one attempt to write a little bit of intellectual history of modern Austrian economics since the 1980s, but I don't name too many names, although I have tried out the thesis on both Mario and Roger at different occasions, so I hope that I have some approval of the people that I am talking about. So, but it's also work that tries to connect, and this is where Blaz's input has been really important, insights from psychology to those in economics. So let me start here. As I was preparing for this talk, I noticed two things. One, this wonderful volume about Dick's work has just come out. We are very fortunate to get it directly to our desk, and I'm not sure, Marta, whether you've even received a copy already, but no. But in it, Jim has a wonderful chapter called The Entangled Mind, which I think dovetails in interesting ways with the story I'm about to tell today. Also, in a recent Marginal Revolution post, Tyler asked how we best use ChatGPT. And so he said the amount of value you get out of these chatbots actually depends on how well you are able to ask questions. And then if you look at what sort of questions he starts asking, they actually depend very strongly on Tyler's own mind. So in some sense, the fact that he is getting interesting answers is as much a result of the chatbot as it is of Tyler. And this, to me, is the basic idea of the extended mind, right? So the idea of the extended mind is a popular idea, first proposed in 1998 in psychology by Chalmers, and it suggests that thinking doesn't stop with our brain, but it actually happens in interaction with our environment. The classic example is note-taking. In note-taking, you offload part of the cognitive effort onto the paper, and you can go back to those notes or revise those notes and be inspired again, or think back to that moment, or think of photographs as being a kind of extended memory of what we do. And I argue here in part in this paper that I think in the Austrian tradition, there's a way of thinking about the price system or the market system that is very similar to how these psychologists think about us interacting with the world and us developing sort of cultural techniques to offload cognitive effort to our environment. I think this, for instance, covered by this famous Whitehead quote from Hayek's 1945 paper: "It is a profoundly erroneous truism repeated by all copybooks and by eminent people when they're making speeches, that we should cultivate the habit of thinking what we are doing. The precise opposite is the case. Civilization advances by extending the number of important operations which we can perform without thinking about them. Right? And one way I think of thinking about these chatbots is that they allow us to do less thinking, or rather focus our efforts on stuff that we can actually add to that thinking that is being done, right? And you can also think of earlier calculators as being of a similar kind, right? After that, you de-emphasize sort of numerical skills in children because the calculator can now do that for you. So human beings can specialize on other efforts which are harder to cognitively offload to the environment. Okay, so why is this relevant? Well, I think it's relevant because Austrian economists are attempting to find answers to recent discussions about rationality that have taken place in, say, the past 20 years that are most famous in the Kahneman and Tversky version of it, right? What's sometimes called the heuristics and biases program, which tries to undermine the idea that humans are rational decision makers and suggest that there are systematic biases in our thinking. Right, so that has been the major challenge. One response has occurred from what you might call from within behavioral economics, and that has suggested that within certain settings, experimental settings that are slightly different from the ones that are developed by the psychological tradition of Kahneman and Tversky, people actually do quite well. So Vernon Smith is very famous for arguing this point and has developed that further into insights about ecological rationality. In an earlier paper with Blaz, we have sort of contrasted the different experimental traditions out of which these come, arguing in part that even though the basic insight of the behavioral economics program, namely that we might well take psychology a little bit more serious than we have in the past by sort of fencing off economics. We shouldn't necessarily be fencing off, but in that paper we ask, well, if we're going to do some importing of psychology or some building on psychology, we should be quite aware of what type of psychology we're importing. And the heuristics and biases program is a sort of particular version of cognitive individualist psychology that might not be very suitable for doing a kind of social science. That's what we argue in that paper, and this builds on that. This idea that rationality is not an individual property of the mind, but rather of the system that we find in Vernon Smith, I think can also be found in recent papers that talk about cognitive institutions. Some of them have appeared in the Journal of Institutional Economics by Frolov and Enrico Petrarca. And I think you can also find it in Betke's recent book on Hayek, where he says that Hayek was an epistemic institutionalist, which, although I don't think that Pete does a whole lot of work toward that end, I think suggests that institutions do epistemic work that is not necessarily done by the individuals themselves, but that is done in interaction with their environment rather than by the individual mind. The other response to this challenge has been the book by Mario Rizzo and Glenn Whitman, who say essentially that the standard of the rational individual was always too stringent, and in fact the subjective critique of Austrian economics had never really been taken seriously. But if it were taken seriously, then a lot of the biases will actually disappear. They will just appear to be the result of different subjective valuations among individuals. And I think they do a really good job in sort of dismantling some of the more grandiose claims. But I do think that ultimately their response is unsatisfactory, because ultimately they have to do a kind of subjectivist retreat, which I don't think is necessary, nor is it very desirable. And that is part of my answer, is that our answer to this rationality challenge should be in the sort of rationality as a systems property and not in a rationality as a kind of limited subjectivist rationality of the individual line. Both can be congruent with Austrian insights, but the question is which is the more convincing one. Right? So to lay this out a little bit more extensively, I think there's a tradition within Austrian economics that emphasizes radical subjectivism and the creative individual. It accepts with qualifications the cognitivist paradigm in which the individual mind is the knower. In fact, it sort of does something more. It posits that this individual knower is even somehow more capable than Max Hu. So whereas Max Hu is just maximizing, right, the Austrian creative individual is also alert to opportunities, or in the Schumpeterian sense, sometimes even able to see, to have visions that go far beyond sort of the sort of limited idea of optimizing within constraints. This is quite different, I think, from another strand that's emerging, and I have some more material to try to convince you of this, but I think it's actually partly at odds with the interactionism and the process view. So interactionism is a term that Paul Lewis has used repeatedly to refer to his reading of Hayek, but he thinks of the price system as an information processing mechanism, and Paul Lewis even goes so far as to sort of bracket the idea of strong methodological individualism, right? So he is skeptical of that and says actually some of the work is being done by the institutional analysis and yes, institutional explaining. It emphasizes the limits of all individuals, although I think, right, and here the interactionism is really important, it is not a kind of structural explanation that says that the price system makes us rational. And those explanations are out there. For instance, I think in zero rationality models, and even in some of Vernon Smith's arguments or experiments, they are subject to a kind of argument that what is really doing the work here is just the structure. So in the Gary Becker version of it, it's the idea that demand curves slope downwards and there's income constraints. So ultimately, the system will give you the outcome. But in the Goda and Sunder sort of zero rationality experiment, you also get everything being explained by structure. I don't think that's necessary. I think the Austrian tradition has this strong interactionist example. And yeah, in trying to think of a sort of concrete way of or something to make that concrete, I was reminded of a story that my colleague Rosalino likes to tell often about Elchin, and Elchin trying to discover what were the materials needed to build the hydrogen bomb. And so Elchin looked up a bunch of likely candidates for being the material needed, and then he looked up stock market valuations of some of the key companies producing these resources. And then he found quite quickly that one of them had, I think, quintupled or quadrupled in value or so over the last year. And from that, he concluded in a paper that was very quickly confiscated by the security agencies and henceforth destroyed in the anecdote, what was the key sort of resource to build the hydrogen bomb. Now, what Elchin there is doing is interacting with the price system. We might sort of claim that the information was already out there, but I would think of it more as an example of Tyler using his mind to ask better questions of the chatbot. I think what Elchin was doing in this story he was asking better questions than most people do of the price system. And I think sort of arbitrage and sort of being alert to opportunities is precisely of this kind. It's being able to interact with your environment in a way that is sometimes better or sort of smarter than others. Yeah. Okay, so why is this radical subjectivism not the way that we should move forward? I think it in some sense, and I guess I foreshadowed this a little bit. I think it puts too much emphasis on the precise cognitive efforts of the individual that have been critiqued quite heavily by this behavioral economics critique. And so for a long time, it was believed that radical subjectivism was, in fact, one of the key distinguishing features of Austrian economics, and that it was the way forward. So we have Hayek. It is probably no exaggeration to say that every important advance in economic theory during the last 100 years was a further step in the consistent application of subjectivism. I think this belief is historically reinforced in the 70s and 80s by Buchanan, Shackle, and in the work of Bob Sugden. You also get a strong version of this. I think there's interesting things to further explore, because I think the Sugden-Buchanan sort of line is even a slightly different form of subjectivism than the one in the Austrian tradition. But it's not so important. I mean, in Rizzo and O'Driscoll, they describe dynamic subjectivism as views the mind as an active, creative entity in which decision-making bears no determinate relationship to what went before. Here, the decision-making is literally a cut, a new beginning. And so, right, it's really a sort of creative mind that doesn't do, say, imitation or rule following or anything of the sort, but that engages in very deliberate moments of choice, forward-looking choice. And I think the empirical evidence points to something else. It points to the fact that human beings do not do this. And so it becomes harder and harder to maintain this. And of course, you can sort of, by adding more layers of subjectivism, say that, you know, human beings really decide to imitate or to rule follow rather than to engage in deliberate actions all the time. But I think this picture drawn by Shackle and Rizzo and O'Driscoll in this early Austrian revival really has not stood up very well to this behavioral economic critique. And the more we subjectivize, and this is a sort of a well-known problem of around 1990, is it becomes more and more indeterminate. So we start to be able to do less and less of any kind of a prediction or explanation in social sciences, because it's all up to the subjective individual, and they're all so heterogeneous that it's very hard to do any kind of systematic explanation. The other point I think I've mentioned already, that I think it's a kind of super rationality that's even more rational than action. So what is the alternative? I think the alternative was right there all along, although we haven't always really emphasized it. So I think Mises in the calculation debate early on suggests that money and monetary calculation act as a facilitator of rational economic decision-making, what in the extended mind literature is called an affordance. Now, I don't want to bore you with all the sort of technical terms from the psychology literature. I don't think that, but it is interesting that Mises draws on precisely the same, or at least the translation of Mises thing draws on exactly the same term. So it writes, monetary calculation affords us a guide through oppressive plenitude of economic potentialities. Without it, capitalistic production would be gropings in the dark. It already emphasizes that, in fact, plenitude, right, oppressive plenitude of choices is a problem, which is one of the key claims in this behavioral economics literature, right, is that sometimes we are overwhelmed by choice and so on, and we cannot really do it. And he says, well, actually, there's tools out there that help us decide it, and that monetary calculation is very important for that, but it's also really accounting rules and double entry bookkeeping and all sorts of other sort of tools that allow us to think of cost-benefit analysis as such a tool, something that helps us do a kind of calculation. We know it's imperfect in some sense, but it is a very important heuristic to get closer to it, right? And it's a way of interacting, and of course we don't use those tools fully mechanically and so on. I think it's also visible in the writings, and this I hope to actually develop later this year in a separate project. I think it's very visible in the way that Austrian economists talk about language. So they see concept as means of clear thinking. So not as reflections of the mind, but rather as extensions of the mind. And when language gets corrupted, the same way that money can get corrupted through bad central banking policies, language can also get corrupted. And that's not merely a problem because it's sort of inefficient in the short run and we might be talking past each other. So it's not merely a semantic issue, but it's a rationality and a thinking issue because we cannot think outside concepts. And so when our concepts are muddled, our thinking is going to be muddled. And I think in Maghloub's work in the middle of the century, you really get this sort of idea that since we think through language, and language is therefore also something that allows us to interact with the world. I think in more recent work, this externalism is very visible. I won't be able to do all the sort of historical details here, but I think it's quite visible in Lachmann, who thinks of guideposts or institutions as guideposts, which I think is very easily in line with this sort of idea of it as an affordance. In Storr's work on entrepreneurship, Virgil Storr's work on entrepreneurship, you actually get shared entrepreneurial ethics. So in Jim's paper, he connects it to the idea of shared mental models. Now, shared mental models, in some sense, right, are a slap in the face to Austrian subjectivism, because what shared mental model? It was meant to be a sort of subjectivist individual mental model that was doing the explanatory work. But I think he's completely right. Jim is correct in that paper. It's shared mental models are doing the work, and they're also doing the explanatory work in the entrepreneurial ethics work of Storr. It's not a purely subjectivist sort of individual story, but instead one about narratives, and narratives that structure where people look for, and those narratives are shared, and they're part of culture. Okay, the stuff about cognitive institutions I've mentioned before, but I think there's interesting work out there. I hope that I have also mildly contributed to that literature with stuff on exemplars. But anyway, so what is this extended mind? Now there's a lot to read, and I'm not sure whether I can do full justice to it, but I think there's lots of reasons why Austrian economists should like this extended mind stuff. And Roger, who I think is in the call, I don't see all the faces, but he was there at the beginning. Early on already picked this up. So he has some papers on our economics should be select, which is, or our notion of knowledge should be select, in which he picks up on this stuff really early, I think only 5 years or so after the psychologists really come with these breakthroughs. But the extended mind is a response to behavioral economics and behavioral paradigms, the same stuff that we dislike in social science, the sort of mechanical stuff. It does away with the stimulus response model, and instead emphasizes interaction and exploration of the environment. It talks of coupling of minds and the environment and affordances in the way that I think right language and the price system are interesting examples of that. It suggests, and here I think especially the literature on entrepreneurship points, the Austrian literature on entrepreneurship points in this direction, the idea that you enact ideas, so not merely that you can think them up, right? The economist does not know where the opportunities are, but they somehow have to be enacted. I think this is quite present in the rivalry stuff that Lavoie does in the 1980s. This knowledge can be embodied, so it can be tacit and inarticulable, which is another Lavoie paper from the 1980s. And 4E cognition also includes embedded, although I don't think that the fourth E is all that important for our social science here. Okay. So where does that leave us, or where does that lead us, rather? I think it leads us toward the idea that radical subjectivism implies that individuals imagine their own future, which makes coordination relatively hard to explain. Instead, the enacted and extended mind suggest coupling and engagement. Individual thought is less independent and more entangled with the environment, including the social and cultural environment. So coordination in part happens through these things that are outside the mind, right? And not because we all sort of have our very own plans that are either congruent or not congruent with each other. Right, and here the coordinated work that's being done by language and by the price system, I think, has been emphasized in this way, although not with these underpinnings in Austrian economics. In Jim's chapter, he talks about whether there's one or many social worlds, which I think is in fact an interesting sort of question. Now, why one or many social worlds? Well, the way I understand his chapter, and we have emailed a little bit, but not so much on this question. I understand as being different institutional environments in which, some sociologists suggest that there are different underlying logics or different kinds of heuristics or norms and rules that people rely on. And of course, there might be instances in which these come into conflict with one another because we either misclassify or differently classify a particular situation, or there might be instances in which, say, the social world or a kind of social reciprocity logic interacts with the logic of profit seeking, say, for instance, when two friends start a business or so on, and the rules and the sort of norms that are associated with it are not completely obvious. I think you might also say this about market and non-market settings, as in markets and politics or something of the sort. Okay, let me conclude with two more slides, if that's okay, Martha. So does this mean we should abandon radical subjectivism? And I think that is too strong, but I do hope to have convinced you slightly that there is some real tension going on here, on which some conceptual clarity might be relevant and might require some further thinking through of the different implications. So I don't think that extended cognition is at odds with the basic idea of subjectivism, but minds are entangled and the subjectivity is therefore less individual, right? Shared mental models are a good example. Creativity is more likely to be the result of interaction than of the individual mind, as in the entrepreneurship theory of, let's throw out a name, Kersner. And there will be more emphasis on institutions, which perhaps by now is the least controversial of these points, especially in a group like this. But I think in sort of history of Austrian economics is actually, there's strands that don't emphasize institutions very heavily at all. That's not true, I think, for the place where I'm currently at, but right, there's different people working on it. The difference plays out in, for instance, responding to the behavioral challenge. Are we going to emphasize the social coordinative mechanisms, or are we going to emphasize the subjectivism? I think Rizzo and Whitman are a wonderful example of it, responding by subjectivism, whereas I think there's lots of responding to do along sort of social science and coordination lines. Yeah, I think Jim's chapter in the book on Dick's legacy points to this idea that there might be incompatible models which are relied upon in different domains of society. Yeah, I'm a big fan of the French sociologists Boltanski and Thévenot, but they are not really, but they suggest a similar sort of notion of different sort of worlds that structure social interaction. And you can, for instance, also think about Hayek's idea of, right, the small communities or the organization versus the extended order and so on, as relying on different sets of rules. So why should you be interested in this Austrian extended mind or this Hayekian extended mind? I think it provides a solid underpinning for Hayek's claim that rules did not come about because humans were intelligent, but instead made humans intelligent. So this is the later Hayek of Law, Legislation, and Liberty, in which he also regards rationality to be an emergent property of systems. And I'm very attracted to that, perhaps because of my earlier work on sort of culture being part of this cognitive environment. And I emphasized in the Viennese students this trio of law, language, and money. And I think they are indeed three very important ways in which humans got smarter. And not because their brains grew, but because our culture sort of allowed us to become smarter. I think it also, in fact, although Hayek's sensory order, right, there's interpretive debates about it, but I think it's actually in line with Hayek's sensory order and the malleable mind, rather than the mind as being a kind of structure or fixed computer that does the rationality for us. In fact, Hayek's sensory order suggests that the mind or the brain evolves based on the interactions it has with the environment, which I think is backed up in this more recent literature on the extended mind. I think there's also lots of fun stuff to do because psychologists are not very good at institutional analysis. So, right, if you feel that this talk was just, okay, the psychologists, they should run the show, I don't think that's at all the case. So I think when they talk about environment, they very often have natural environments in mind. And especially if they're more of the evolutionary kind, they might say all sorts of things about the way in which our either our sentiments or whatever our other thing they're gonna use there have evolved in response to a natural environment. I think, in fact, the Austrians here have lots to contribute about how cultural environments have evolved and have evolved also quite recently, say in the past 200 years. I think it provides interesting links to this idea that local and contextual knowledge are very important or very relevant, that is knowledge for which interaction with the environment is a prerequisite, that which you cannot write down in books, right? That Hayek so much emphasizes as there being knowledge of the man on the spot, or that is local and contextual. And this is in this extended mind literature, cognition is very closely connected to action. And even though, of course, we have noticed this point for a long time, I don't think anybody, aside from some hand waving saying there's some stuff that you cannot aggregate, has been fully able to really put their finger on it. Now, I wasn't sure whether Cameron was going to be here, but I know that he hates Austrian business cycle theory. But I wanted to stick up in one way for this, and let me end there. Right? If we think that the environment is part of our cognitive tools, then the corruption of that environment, the corruption of that cognitive environment is going to be really, really crucial, right? So for a long time, the sort of idea that entrepreneurs are misled by a central bank interest rate that is somehow wrongly set, either too high or too low, has been regarded as a kind of weird bias in the system. And so therefore it's not fully consistent with a sort of rationality postulate, even with relatively weak rationality postulates. And I'm not saying that, right, we should go back to the idea that people can be fooled all the time, in all places by false prices. But if we think of these prices as extensions of the mind, rather than as sort of efficient signals that come our way, I think that actually provides some renewed credence to this idea that because prices have been tampered with, the tools that we normally rely on no longer work. And of course, that can prompt us to update our tools or to rely on alternative tools that are not so strongly dependent on whatever policy decisions are made by a central bank. But nonetheless, I think there's plausibility for the idea that even in the medium run, people might be misled because the cognitive environment on which they have relied successfully in the past has been altered. Okay, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Erwin. So yeah, let's open it to questions. I think just a small comment that Larry White makes that point frequently, right? On the sort of with high inflation that you cannot engage in long-term planning, right? So that speaks to your point. All right. Let's see here. Yeah, if you just like form the queue with the reactions, the hand up, that will make things easier for us.
Yes, should I ask Roger? Because he has his hand up.
Yeah, oh yeah, I see that now. Yes, Roger. Okay, yeah.
You're still muted, Roger.
Thank you. I'm so sorry about that. Now I understand better a conversation we had at, I guess, at the Southern, right? Yeah. I wouldn't have thought of the stuff I do as somehow in tension with, the Rizzo Whitman book. So that's kind of interesting. I'll try to reflect on that. This is a wonderful talk. I just want to maybe just to mention like 2 or 3 things, and then that's that. Economists specialize in models that are robust to individual psychology. This is kind of a Mark Schultz point. So, what's the effect in a reasonably competitive market? What's the effect of, an increase in tariffs on the price of domestic trade? Okay, well, I don't have to know a lot about individual psychology to work that out. So that's what Schultz called anonymous ideal types. So when so is your model or is it not robust to individual psychology? If not, then psychology matters. I'm sorry, if it's not robust, then the psychology matters. If the psychology doesn't matter, probably rational choice is going to be a good way to go, although you can't decide that. Point number 2, and then point number 3. Point number 2, what does subjectivism mean? After our discussion in Florida, Erwin, I chanced upon an old characterization of subjectivism I had made, that it's all about what goes on in your brain, and I now see that indeed my view of subjectivism has changed. Subjectivism in its original sort of meaning is simply varies from one individual to another. So radical subjectivism can, and I think now should be, simply that the interpretive models, the interpretive frames that different persons use are themselves different. They vary from one person to the other. Finally, if I may just put in a kind of advertisement for Honda Rink's notion of the all-seeing eye. There's this fabulous criticism of the standard, the Simon type bounded rationality from this guy Honda Rink, and then Teppel-Fehlin and he have been co-authoring on this. I think, and they cite, I figure a few of you will know this guy Uksku, the old biologist. I think that stuff is great and very informs my work. And I just wanted to use this as kind of a shallow excuse to put in a plug for that.
So I don't think they're very much questions, Roger, but to respond to the first point, I don't think that, and I think there's actually an attractive element of this extended mind notion. It doesn't really come with a sort of model of the brain or suggest that right, there's a kind of structure of biases or a computational structure to the mind that is homogeneous, but rather it tries to conceptualize, I think, the relationship between the individual and their environment. And perhaps one way of putting it is that in the old conception, the individual was too much the master or a sort of supreme navigator of the environment. And here, the way to which the extent to which the environment is structured in a smart way or possesses certain institutions allow us to navigate it better. So I don't know whether this is actually, the psychologists would actually allow this example, but I think of this as street signs, right? So if you're trying to find somebody's home, and it's a completely culturally unstructured environment, there might not even be street signs. So you have to rely on sort of completely on other people's knowledge and ask them around. And over time, we developed more abstract ways of signifying places, and street names are a very basic, not very abstract version of it, but they allow people who are not familiar in a particular neighborhood to still locate particular houses. And of course, that then extends into now Google Maps and navigational tools that allow us to offload even more of that information up to the point where, right, the old idea that the London cabbie needed to memorize all the London streets by name or by heart is no longer relevant at all, because that is simply not cognition anymore that is required to navigate that environment. And so we went from having the right social connections to having knowledge of a mildly abstract system to now having access to a set of technological tools. And so I perhaps it's too long a sort of digression, but I think, right, this is what the extended mind stuff does. It doesn't, I think, put in a different version of an algorithm in the brain, but rather it says we have to think seriously about this relationship of the individual to their environment. So if you agree that
I think that is good qualification to what I said. Yeah, wonderful.
If you're on board with subjectivism is just heterogeneity, I've heard other people express this. When I sent an email to Jim, he was sort of saying, well, you're, but I'm paraphrasing here, but everybody already agrees, Erwin. There's nothing to argue about here anymore. People have already abandoned this sort of radical subjectivism strand. Then fine, another nail in the coffin, perhaps. But if it's just such heterogeneity, then I'm fully on board. But we can then, of course, say that it's heterogeneous groups that might be able to do the work in our explanatory models, which, right, I think would still make people uneasy. Although I think, for instance, in Virgil Storr's work, we do get this sort of stuff, and Jim's work or Jim's argument about entangled minds sharing mental models or sharing narratives is at least a step in that direction, which I think is of some significance. Your papers and the all-seeing eye, I think, is indeed a wonderful metaphor to keep people in a little bit on the conversation we had. I was asking Roger at the time whether he put all the explanatory power in some of his more recent work on the environment, right? And so an evolutionary metaphor might do this in sort of saying that it's the selection mechanisms within the environment that do the explanatory work, rather than the individual action or the interactionism. And yeah, Roger should state his own position, but I think he sort of said, no, I never wanted to do that. So the interactionism is indeed the right version of it, a more appropriate.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so, if I'm understanding you, yes.
All right. Shall we move on to the next question? Yeah. Okay.
I've found myself a bit sort of perplexed by these two different conceptualizations, in part, I think, because I wonder whether is it reasonable to speak of people as having purposes when they engage in theoretical effort? What I have in mind is, I think you can find in the history of economics at least two different kind of sources of interest to the question, well, why do I want to study economics? And I think one line of questioning is of the sort of wanting to understand better something mysterious. That's the question of, goes back ages ago into how it is that societies seem to have orderly patterns to them when there's no one there who's responsible for creating and maintaining that order. That was, of course, goes back to Smith's moral philosophy, but just simply understanding how we humans have the organizational patterns that we experience. But then there's another kind of branch. I think it came into the foreground with the discovery of the calculus and the idea of maximums and minimums. And that if you have someone doing behavioral economics, or not, my reading of most behavioral economics is that people are doing this work because they think there are significant numbers of people who can't manage their personal affairs very well. And so they either want to make them do better or help them do better, whichever way, but there's a sense that many people aren't very good at what we might call economizing action. And so it's economics as a kind, you might want to use that term, social engineering. That's not something I've ever used, as I recall, but still, there's that. But then there's also an alternative conception of economics as a way of understanding just how it is that the order that we experience takes its shape, as well as the fact that we also recognize that this order is continually under tension of change. And indeed, your book on the Austrian students of civilization was set very much in that kind of concern with a set of economists who were concerned with the progress or lack of civilized living together, since in all cases, humans are all living together in close geographical spaces, and that's going to impose various constraints on us. It is often other people, there's that old start hell as other people kind of recognition, that as well as the division of labor, productivity, and so forth. And I've been curious, do you see any kind of, I might say, communication problem in terms of what people call economics is not there a sense in which, if you're trying to explain how societies hang together or not, then you have another discipline devoted to improving by certain standards what people do. Is there any kind of problem of incongruity when you have a bunch of thinkers who perhaps pretend to be or think they're thinking about the same object, but yet are they really? That I mean, excuse me, we're in the allergy season already here in Tallahassee, and it's really getting to me. But I guess I sometimes really find myself just wondering what kind of problems might come about, because on the one hand, if you for instance, use a graph theory representation of society within a bunch of nodes and connections among those nodes, and then within that representation, people in various ways form various organizations. Some of them are commercial, eleemosynary, political, and so forth. But I think with that representation, one thing that seems apparent is there is no place where anyone can act on society to change it, as against always people acting inside society as they want to pursue change that appeals to them. And I don't know, it's something that has just increasingly come to bother me by what I see as kind of a disintegration of a sense of the classical core of economic theory, going back from Smith through Mill and so forth, and a few people afterwards. And I don't know whether that's something that anyone can do anything about. I guess my basic reading of system theory is that no one can do anything about that. Everyone basically has to act locally, not globally, but that some areas of local action are more influential than others. And so I don't, anyway, I'll stop there. It's, in a way, I hesitate to just throw out my perplexities to you, but I was fascinated by your presentation and found myself thinking, damn, you're really wrestling with some matters that have really been gnawing at me for quite some time. And I thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I mean, from that perspective, right, I think there's quite a lot to worry about. So, right, a former GMU professor, Eric Wagner, just has a book out, How Economics Can Save the World. Now, it's not all behavioral economics, but behavioral economics plays a pretty key role in that book. And he's come to represent essentially, right, this sort of engineering school, or the nudge version of this modern engineering school. We have Rizzo and Whitman trying to sort of lower the bar for welfare standards, I think, in their book. I read their book as a sort of attempt to say, well, not so quick, not so quick, not so quick. And it's a whole bunch of warnings, but ultimately they end up having to engage in discussions about what the appropriate welfare evaluations are, and at what point we can start to say that people indeed cannot take good care of. And I might be wrong, and Blaz, please correct me, but I actually think that this psychological school actually brings back some of that wonder. So they like some of the social scientists I admire, are amazed by the degree of coordination and the degree of intelligence that human beings with pretty limited cognitive capabilities and very great societies have. And so they seek to explain that. And of course, one simple way to explain it is to assume a whole bunch of rationality at the level of the individual, so that you can explain that at the level of society, things will also work out. But they do not do this. They instead say, no, the cognitive capabilities at the micro level, at the individual level, are actually quite limited. And so we have to look at the cognitive structures that people develop in order to still cope. And I see this work on the extended mind as being a sort of, akin to thinking about the social structures that facilitate coordination versus the kind of social structures that don't do this. It would be silly to deny that there's not some people working in this approach or this field that think that somehow the cognitive structure is being upset because there's now smartphones, and so we offload too much, and so we lose all of our cognitive capabilities, and something should be done about that, right? That is apparently a human impulse that one will find anywhere. But I do think that on the whole, this literature is interesting because it actually thinks much more in terms of empowering cognitively fairly limited individuals, or figuring out why they manage to do quite well despite all their limitations, rather than emphasizing those limitations and then using them as a justification for interfering with their choices.
All right, I don't see any hands now, but I know Roger wanted to go back to a point, so let's do that, Roger, if you want to.
Great, wonderful. There we go. Just Lachmann had discussed all the time, Lachmann, the radical subjectivist, although, I noticed, Erwin, that you put him in this kind of externalist box. Lachmann, the radical subjectivist, said that there were three types or levels, I forget, of subjectivism. Subjectivism of case of preferences, subjectivism of expectations, and the third one was subjectivism of interpretations. Now, we do need to model agents, people, as interpretive agents. So there's an interpretive framework. as fully as it may be sort of, aided by and part of and not separate from so-called extrasomatic stuff, like you said, prices, something to write down in the book. I used the example of the egg timer, the egg timer knows when to turn off the fire, not you, and so on and so on, right? I think that, I do totally think that's like a big deal to me. But still, there's an interpretive framework there. And that interpretive framework varies from individual to individual. From actor, I would say, to be even a little bit more sort of vague and open-ended about what is the interpretive entity, right? What's the agent? Anyway, that interpretive framework varies from agent to agent. So I thought it was a hell of a talk, and I want to read the paper carefully. You're making some distinctions and some points, that I just feel I've been insensitive to and will be smarter if I can really absorb. But I don't know if at the end of the day I'm going to end up being, or if I am today, less radically subjectivist than I was, I don't know, 25 years ago. That's like Dick, that's an expression of perplexity and not a categorical affirmation.
So if I can just very briefly respond on Lachmann, because I've had this objection leveled at me before. And Roger, especially from you, you're probably right. You've been around him. But I have this paper with Pavel on Lachmann and Shackle on interpretation instruments. And there Lachmann is making this, this point that is too simplistic, but he's making a point that's very akin to my talk today, right? And what is the example he uses? Timetables from a train. To explain to Shackle what an institution is, he says it's timetables for a train. Now that could come straight out of this literature as a perfect example of a cultural system that we have developed that make the world more easily navigatable, that lower the cognitive load on individuals, right? Your metro runs every 10 minutes, and that it does so, hopefully more or less reliably. So I don't know which country they had in mind at the time when they were discussing the trains, but right, that and I think more broadly, Lachmann, with the sort of capital structure and complementarities, his work really points in this direction of externalism more than it does on the surface of his writings on subjectivism. So yes, in methodological statements, you're absolutely correct, but I do think that there's a lot of the Lachmann applied analysis actually points much more in this direction. And I think you can say this too for Mises. Like, I think there's this is an important, to me at least, but perhaps I'm too nerdy or too obsessed over these things, but I think it's an important interpretive debate over Mises too, because in Mises you also get relatively strong sort of subjectivist statement when he does his methodological pronouncements. But then when we go back and look at what he's actually doing in the calculation in the socialist commonwealth, he's actually making a very institutionally contingent argument on money being there, the price system being there, all sorts of institutions being present in order to facilitate this rationality. So it's not that the rationality was already there, and the rationality will not be there if you remove the institutions, right? So right, that is the critique of socialism.
I think I'm with you every step of the way there, including sort of how you're reading Lachmann. But I think we have to recognize that Lachmann wasn't always super clear in not only in his writings, but I think in his own head, because he always insisted that Shackle was the master subjectivist. But the Lachmann that you're describing, which is the Lachmann that I preferred, that's not Shackle. Right, Shackle is the thing you quoted. Was it Rizzo or Rizzo?
Yeah, Rizzo and
Driscoll. Rizzo and Driscoll. Right, that's important because now we're going back to 1980.
Yeah, 5.
what are five,
yeah.
right? It was the cut, right?
Yeah,
Which,
that's the shackle.
as you probably know, Dedekind, the great mathematicians, defined real numbers, but with the Dedekind cut, right? So it's that same model of the real line, right? Which you can also find described in St. Augustine's description of time. Although, I mean, he doesn't use, of course, terms such as real line or realize the math, what would later become the mathematical analogy. But it's there in Augustine, it's there in Shackle. Lachmann kept saying, always said that Shackle, was obviously influenced by Bergson. No, he wasn't. Bergson's a different thinker. Shackle is much more, rationalist and subjectivist, if I can be permitted to use those words just super loosely. But Lachmann himself didn't see it. He thought he was, cheek by jowl with Shackle. So I don't know if we have to say there's two Lachmans or whatever, but I like your Lachmann. That ain't Shackle. And it's a shame that Shackle didn't see. I'm sorry, Lachmann didn't see this difference between him and Shackle.
Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna jump in with a sort of question here to clarify in my head, maybe help others clarify this distinction between radical subjectivism and extended mind. So I'm trying to think of a person that moves in an institutional environment, like some dramatic change, right? Sort of similar to the inflation example, but think of someone with an experience of extreme poverty, maybe Holocaust or Great Depression, right? And that said, what do you learn, right? You learn to be extremely careful with food and use every part of animal, like, right? That's rational. And then if radical subjectivism is correct, that person then in the experience of abundance, right, moves to the US, 21st century, whatever, would not have any institutional, like they wouldn't have the hang-ups of poverty, right? They would adjust based on prices. But most likely, right, like if we look at psychological literature, they're actually not gonna just respond like everyone else, right? That experience of poverty is going to affect their choices, right? And they might engage in some hoarding behavior and so on. So I don't know, would that sort of like that institutional so your experience of a certain institutional hang-up, right, teaches you certain things, and then institutional setup might change, but your behavior stays the same. Would that be the extended mindset version of behavior? I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think this is a wonderful example, Martha. And yeah, of course, the degree to which there's updating is an important question that I think you cannot really settle by doing theory well. But yeah, the dynamic that you describe is of course very visible among different generations. How my grandparents treated food from how my parents did, and so on. Yeah, I think even my Tinbergen book has an anecdote, although I don't know if it made the English version, but about their guests being shocked that they even ate the crumbs of the sandwiches in the first years after the war, right? Which was a practice they clearly had developed during the war, even though the others hadn't experienced occupation that way. I think it's good. I mean, to just give one more example that I will never forget is the paper I did with Blaz in the Journal of Economic Methodology. Is they argue if you put people in a lab and you don't allow them to talk, you don't give them a real environment, you don't give them all their clues or all their cues, everything they typically rely on to make decisions has been taken. So it's kind of like you tied their hands to their backs, and now you're asking them, can you still be smart? And the answer that this other alternative methodological school within psychology says, no, you cannot be smart anymore when you've taken away all the things that people typically rely on to make decisions. That's precisely when they start to fail. And that's, of course, not how you would think if you think that cognition is something that happens in the head, because then why would it matter that your hands are tied behind your back? They don't do any of the work, any of the cognitive work. And why does it matter that you're in a white room or behind a computer screen? Well, that wouldn't matter in that sort of world. But yeah.
All right, very good. So we have two hands, Nathaniel and then Paolo. So let's move on to you.
Thanks, Erwin. This is great stuff. I think what I perceive maybe happening here is a bit of recovery of the Austrian tradition towards the analytical egalitarian approach in ways that it otherwise might be more hierarchical than egalitarian, in that we're including institutions or introducing things that as institutions that previously were just considered as behavior. So, you give the example that I'm not familiar with, but from the timetables for the trains, and that works unless you also happen to know, but the conductor stops to take tea on Tuesdays with his aunt at the stop right before yours, right? You learn these kinds of habits and behaviors, and all of these are in informal institutions, which we've been excluding from our definition of institution, or some people do, right? If we include that informal element as part of what we count as an institution, of course, we get better results. And, Michaela does a whole lot of work on this line as well. To include that as part of the cognitive act is to say that this is another institution that people are nested within, and you get at that some through language and those kinds of things as well. And I think it's internally consistent, because how can you judge what is cognitive without a framework for deciding what cognitive is? And where do you learn that? Only by approbation from your peers whom teach you how to think, right? And so you talk about, your grandparents still eating the crumbs off of plates. And I remember my grandparents still had canned goods in the basement in case the Great Depression would come back, or they had cash hidden under their mattresses and in their books. How do we learn that? Well, we learn that by watching and through those informal institutions, and they're only trained away very, very gradually. It's only my students in this generation that doesn't have a connection with the Great Depression in that same way to understand what frugality even means. So those are the kinds of things that I think when I read or listen to your talk, and I do look forward to reading a final product on this.
Yeah, Nathaniel, I think those are all very good examples. I was going through a book which otherwise is not very good on the extended mind, but one of the chapters called Thinking with Peers, and it essentially asks or suggests that if you're among good peers, you're much smarter than you would otherwise be. Right? And there's different elements to this. One is, I think, the chat GPT sort of stuff is, who to ask the question to. So you have a network of 10 people that you can very easily interact with. And those 10 people, which one of those 10 is probably the smartest to sort of ask when they know something, or whether they know something. It also suggests, and I think this is even, I've just taught Lavoie's rivalry and central planning again, but the sort of idea that there's also contestation in a seminar setting or so, and that we are thinking with those other people and arriving at knowledge that otherwise wouldn't be present, right? I think this is one of Lavoie's arguments in rivalry and central planning, is that the prices that emerge through rivalry is knowledge that otherwise wouldn't be generated. So the process is integral to the outcome. And I think there's ways of thinking here about knowledge and a setting like a seminar in a similar way. It generates knowledge, so it's not aggregation, right? So this is even the sort of, it's not aggregation like we have 12 smart people and they put everything they know on the table, and then we're smarter than we were before because obviously 12 know more than one. But there's knowledge being generated in the conversation between them that otherwise wouldn't exist. So I think, I really think it's and of course, right, there's different substrands, but I really think it's a very fruitful way of combining with Austrian insights, and those things are really being explored in that extended mind literature, or 4E cognition as it's now called. Paolo?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you, Marta and Michaela, for inviting me to join this group. And hello, Erwin and Blaz. Blaz, nice to meet you. Nice to see you first of all on the screen. Well, just three suggestions, no more than that. The first one, the first two are, the first is on the notion of shared mental model. The second is about extended mind. And the third is about Sagden. Now, the shared mental model is the very definition of institution used by Veblen. So you might wish to exploit a little bit Veblen's thought, or maybe even better, I would suggest Hodgson reading Veblen in the famous article about what are institutions. That should be the title by Hodgson. Yeah. He was using Veblen a lot to explain the so-called inside out, or what he calls the inside out of the institution, by using the metaphor of Klein's battles, where this inside out is quite clear. I mean, the way in which we interiorize institutions and we interact with this externality. So it's no more than a suggestion, but I think that might be useful. The second is about the notion of extended mind, and in particular mind. And I wonder whether this notion of mind is, in a sense, still too much within the paradigm, the modern paradigm of rationality. Let me give you an example that might help you to understand the point. For centuries, institutions were, in a sense, based and also vehicled or gained legitimacy through images, rituals, myths, discourses, and many other aesthetics, so to say, the so-called aesthetics of institutions. Now, is it the reason that grasp the image on which this kind of institutions are based, or is sentiments, affects, affectus, so to say in Latin, or something that cannot be easily, grasped by reason? And I think this is something that, at least thinking about your study on culture and the things that we discussed when I was at Mercatus, I think that should be very interesting for you, because there is this kind of trend of studies about semiotics of institutions, semiotics of law, and that in a sense should be, maybe might help you to at least explain how institutions can get the legitimacy they need or can be interiorized. We know the perverse side, I would say, of the aesthetic of institution because of the experience of totalitarian regimes, because they've been exploiting a lot rituals, images, and I would say persuasion in a very bad meaning. But anyway, that is the pathological side, but that is not necessary, because even today we are luckily enough out of totalitarian regimes. But even today, we have national hymns or many other stuffs for which we can, in a sense, gather together people, a mass, and we can make a society out of this mass of people, thanks to the role played by institutions. So that the notion of mind, I sense, is still too much within the paradigm of modern rationality. The last point is about your citation of Sagden. You may be right, but I suggest you to read Sagden's works on team reasoning, because the team reasoning maybe is still a form of radical subjectivism, but in the works by Sagden on team reasoning, I sense that there is some sense of rationality that is a little bit closer to your notion of extended mind. I'm not sure, this is a doubt, but anyway, just these 3 points. And thanks, because I think this is a really interesting project. So go on, and I would like to read it when it is written down.
We'll get to it. I mean, there's lots of notes, but it was indeed not written out. So apologies for that. So on this, pulling it closer to Hodgson, yes, I don't think we reference him currently, but I see that as a very important sort of underlying motif here. So I fully agree. I will go back to that particular because I hadn't really connected it directly here, but yes, I think this is part of the result. And Hodgson even recently engaged in, I think, what is still wrong with Austrian economics is the advances in Austrian economics volume. And Hodgson there sort of says we need a more serious institutionalism. And then Pete says yes, but then also does a sort of skirting trick, which says no. Anyway, I like the idea of mind being the wrong concept. So the only alternative I have is just not very attractive. It's the idea that we're part of a cognitive system. And I perhaps Dig will like that idea in the sense that it brings the language closer to system theory more broadly. But I do think that if we start talking about a cognitive system, we might lose the very thing that we're sort of also wanting to make central, which is the acting agent. And so I'm not sure whether, but it is interesting if you start thinking about the market as a cognitive system rather than as a place where individuals make decisions. I think even that sort of reframing is interesting. I like the ideas or the examples that you give, but they don't like write images, myths, narratives as being sort of part of this cognitive environment of which we're part, and then being very important. I don't think we should at all regard that as pathological. In fact, that might be the way of knowing in those instances. But whether they point to something different as mind, I'm not sure. If you have any ideas on a different concept of mind, because I sort of see the way you're now trying to stretch almost literally, right, by extended mind. The thing. And Sugden, I will return to, I interviewed Sugden, and there he really committed to being a radical subjectivist. And I didn't get to that part, but I think it's very important that Buchanan gets his subjectivism from existentialism. And he doesn't get it from the Austrian Verstehen tradition. And I think that actually shows in how these traditions play out. So these are not very explicit appropriations among their parts, but it does have implications for the way it then sort of develops later on, or what sort of things it makes you think of. And I think the Verstehen sort of Schütz tradition was always more socially oriented than the Buchanan version that was more individualist rationalist was. And Sugden, as far as I was able to get out of him when I interviewed him, remained an extreme version of this sort of Buchananite, being the ultimate anti-paternalist. I asked him whether he would want to give advice to his kids, and then he said no, they should make up their own minds. So that was so he was not even paternalistic as a parent. So that was sort of one extreme version of it.
It's quite refreshing. I see that Dick has his hand up. So if you want to ask that question, and that will need to be our last question of the day. Oh.
Yeah, just one question or remark in terms of, Erwin, your your remarks on cognitive systems. And I want to relate it to some of my tergiversations on what economics is all about these days. Okay. And that certainly there's a style of economics that we all here would agree with that has a normative element to it, which envisions people fundamentally as creators of their lives, being responsible for their creations, so on and so forth. Then there is an intellectual approach out there that I would say is embraced by 2/3 of the American Economic Association these days, which is that there is limited scope for people to be able to make responsible decisions on their conduct. And that if you look at the not just the growth of government in terms of percentage of GDP, which has exploded over the past century, but even more so with the fundamental replacement of private law societies with fundamentally public ordering is ubiquitous throughout society. There's still private ordering, but private ordering is always capable of being trumped by public ordering. So in which case there's an image of some kind of ruling elite that is exempt. And so I think you have a two-structure kind of view of society, ideally speaking, of some people who are basically, I think it's a new feudalism of their being lords of the manor who are responsible for the people who are on the manor, but those on the manor just have to do their business. And so I think this cognitive matter, I think, is tied in with a deep level contestation over what kind of a discipline we're creating as we go forward.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, with that, I guess we will conclude. Erwin, thank you so much for a very thought-provoking presentation. I think you make a strong case here for this new or altered approach. Before we finish, I actually have some good news to share with you all. So Dave Hebert has kindly agreed to join Michaela and I in leading EPERN. He will be our new associate director. And with that, he also...
Yay!
Yeah, yes, thank you, Dave, yes. And they will lead the seminars during the next academic year. So when we send out the call for papers this summer, Dave will help us select the ones that will be presented next year, and he will be the one leading the calls and leading the discussion. So I'm super excited for his perspective and to work with him, and grateful that he's agreed to do that with us. So yeah, that's the bit of good news. We anticipate 26 inches of snow today in Minnesota. So this is like the last moment for me to run, get groceries, pick up the kids from school, and then we'll be snowed in for probably the rest of the week. But that's where we are. So yeah. Thank you all for everything. Thank you, Erwin, again for joining us and sharing your work. Blaz, thank you. And yeah, have a great week, and I'll see you next month. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Owen.
Goodbye, all.
Bye.